Mr. President, we have a very important role in the Senate to provide advice and consent on nominees. Our forefathers who wrote the Constitution envisioned that this power would be used rarely because a president, knowing that this power existed, would nominate highly suitable people for the posts that they were intended to occupy. But we haven't seen highly suitable people coming through this chamber this year. In fact, we see one person after another so fabulously unsuited for the office or position to which they are nominated. We saw Scott Pruitt, who took on and attacked regulations designed to create clean air across this country time after time after time. Very close association with the fossil fuel industry that wanted to allow more particulates which cause a tremendous amount of health damage in this country. We saw Betsy DeVos come through this chamber, an individual who was nominated to be Secretary of Public Education, but had never stepped inside a public school, didn't respect public schools, hadn't had children in public schools, hadn't volunteered in public schools, wanted to decimate public schools. The best thing we could do for public schools would have been to turn down that nomination. But this chamber just locked up and said, boy, you know, we're going to do everything we can to damage public education. Well, many of us stood up against that and said, no, let's fight for somebody who's going to make public education better, not tear it down. But that's not what we got. And now we have another individual here to be considered on the floor of the Senate, Bill Wehrum. Bill Wehrum, nominated to head EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. Well, Bill Wehrum has made a career out of working for powerful special interests and attacking any effort to make the air cleaner. Is that a person suitable for this role of protecting the air we breathe and making it better? Someone who has sought to make it worse? No, during the nomination hearing, I put up a very simple chart. I wanted to understand his thoughts about what was driving climate disruption. And I put up a chart showing what NASA data showed for the solar impacts, solar flares and so forth, which are sometimes people say, well, maybe it's solar flares that are causing the warming of the planet. And NASA had this data which showed a flat line on that and then a rising temperature. And I said, any sign of correlation between these two lines? And his response was kind of like, well, what do you mean? It's correlation. He didn't have any understanding of the basics of how to compare one thing to another. And so I put up another chart. And that other chart showed all of the activities that are considered to be ones that might contribute to global warming that are not man-made activities, things like the solar flares and volcanic activity. And again, the NASA data showed a flat line and then the rising temperature. And I said, does there appear to be any correlation between this flat line and this rising temperature? And he again said, I just don't understand the data. I can't really comment on that. And yet anyone with any basic ability to digest information would recognize that there was no correlation. You didn't have two things moving in the same direction. And then I put up this chart right here. Now this chart shows that same temperature observe the black line, and then it shows the line for rising carbon dioxide. And I said, well, are these things correlated? Do you see any relationship between one line rising and the other line rising? Again, he refused to answer. How is it we can put someone into a position who can't even look at and comment on basic data, who has been a hired hand for the fossil fuel industry, who has fought to make our air filthier and more damaging to our health? But that's the nominee we have, a nominee who has sued on behalf of very powerful interests, EPA 31 times, to try to degrade the controls for things like mercury, a potent neurotoxin that damages the brains, particularly of our children. Why should we have somebody who wants more mercury in our air to be in this position considering air quality? Well, it certainly doesn't make any sense to me. He did have a chance to serve in this position in acting capacity back in 2006, so he's been there before. And he adopted guidelines on mercury emissions that had entire passages lifted word for word from information provided by the industry. The industry didn't want to regulate the mercury, and he just took their language and said, that's what we'll do. We'll do what industry says. He wasn't working for the American people. He was working for the powerful and the privileged. And then he told an EPA staffer, quote, not to undertake the normal scientific and economic studies when crafting important rules. He instructed his staff not to look at the scientific information when constructing rules. What did he want them to look at? He wanted them to just take the language from industry. That certainly is not protecting the public interest. As the New York Times wrote, he has sought to elevate corporate interests above those of the public. Well, this is not a position in a company. This is not a position in a corporation. This is a position of public trust. So he has failed that test. In fact, he failed it so badly that although he was nominated in 2006, when there was a Republican majority in this chamber, his nomination was subsequently rejected by the U.S. Senate. Well, back then we had folks who really actually cared on both sides of the aisle, far more about air quality. Now it seems like the enormous amount of funding from the Koch brothers for campaigns across the country have squelched any consideration from my colleagues about the quality of the air or the quality of our water. And this nomination is certainly a test of that. If colleagues do care about the quality of our air, they will act like their predecessors did back in 2006, and they will reject this nomination. An individual who's betrayed the public trust should not be confirmed to a position of public trust. Thank you, Mr. President.